What's up, everybody? I'm Mike from the Bunker Recordings and BetterMixes.com, and today we're checking out Trackspacer from Wavesfactory. So Trackspacer is basically a frequency-dependent sidechain ducking plugin, or in simple terms, it gets crap out of the way of each other. So let's hop into Pro Tools and see it in action. All right, so like I said, the job of Trackspacer is to clear up space and get things out of the way of one another. So let's take a quick listen to part of this track I brought up without any instances of Trackspacer, and then we'll see where we could use Trackspacer to clear up some space.
That's fine, I say. Oh, nice try. I'd rather die. Oh, you say.
By the way, this song is called Flaws by the band Bonsai Trees. I will link to their Spotify down in the description down below, so be sure to check them out. But anyway, this is sounding pretty good, but there are a few things that are kind of clashing in the mix. The first one I like to take a look at is this acoustic guitar riff and the vocals. Let me just solo up this guitar so you can hear what I'm talking about. So yeah, earlier in the song, this riff comes kind of in between vocal lines, so it doesn't cause a problem. But here in this last chorus, it just repeats over and over, and it really starts to fight with the vocal. So let's solo up our vocals as well. And let's bring up Trackspacer and see what we can do. So we have this inserted on our guitar riff. And the first thing we're going to want to do is set the sidechain input. Without the sidechain set, Trackspacer isn't going to do anything. So in this case, I have the sidechain input just set to this bus that I made called Vox Sidechain. And I have all my vocals sending to that bus. Now that we have that set, Trackspacer is going to start doing its thing. It's going to duck the guitar riff anytime the vocals come in. But unlike doing this with just, say, a compressor, Trackspacer isn't going to duck everything equally. It's going to look at the frequency response of the vocal and create sort of a reverse EQ curve and duck that out of the guitar. So in other words, wherever the vocal is sitting, that's what it's going to take out of the acoustic guitar, making room for the vocal. If you're not quite following yet, I'm going to hit play and you'll see a representation of what I'm talking about in the graph up here, and I think that'll clear it up. But anyway, I'm going to bring our amount knob down to 0, and then I'm just going to slowly bring this up while it plays, which is going to make Trackspacer duck more and more out of the acoustic.
Hey, that's fine, I say. Oh, nice try. I'd rather die.
All right, so hopefully you can see what I was talking about there. It was ducking a lot more up here in the mid-range than it was down in the low end, because there's not a ton of low end in that vocal. So it was only ducking where the vocal is actually living. Now from there, we've got these two other knobs, our low cut and our high cut, and we can use this to further modify where the ducking is actually happening. So if we bring the low cut up, for instance, if we brought it up to here, then our low end would not be ducking at all. It would only be ducking above, in this case, about 1K. And the same thing with our high cut knob. We can bring that down and use them in conjunction to only duck the mid-range or just duck the low end or whatever. In this case, I think I'm going to try to focus it around the mid-range here. A minute ago, when I was playing the example and cranking up the amount knob, once I got enough ducking happening to clear up the vocal, the guitar was kind of just disappearing. So I'm going to use these filters to focus the ducking into the mid-range, because that's where these two elements are really clashing with each other. So I'm going to hit play again and just tweak these three knobs until we get something working pretty well.
Hey, that's fine, I say. Oh, nice try. I'd rather die. Oh, you say. That's fine, I say. Oh, nice try. I'd rather die.
So I brought the low cut up to 1K and the high cut down to about 4.5K. So hopefully you could hear as I was doing that, all the body of the acoustic guitar was being left alone. And then we're also leaving in all of the nice shimmery top end. So let's do a quick before and after and see what we've done.
Hey, that's fine, I say. Oh, nice try. I'd rather die.
So yeah, that's definitely helping. It's just clearing up a little bit of room for the vocal without completely getting rid of our guitar. You could definitely go more extreme with this if you wanted to. In fact, let's just do that just so you can hear it a little bit better. I'll bring the low cut down a little bit so we're affecting a little bit more. And we'll do the same on the top end, and then we'll crank the amount a little bit so you can really hear the effect.
Hey, that's fine, I say. Oh, nice try. I'd rather die. Oh.
So hopefully you can hear how much clearer that is with Trackspacer in. And one quick thing while I'm thinking of it. In that last example there, you could see our gain reduction line in the graph was, I don't know, maybe down somewhere around this area, which according to the readout in the top right corner here, says we were getting like between 40 and 50 decibels of reduction. And that's just straight up wrong. I noticed this almost right away when I got this plugin. I don't know if it's just a weird bug or if it's just something weird on my system or what, I don't know. But the amount of reduction listed up here in the corner seemed way off to me, and I did a little bit of testing and it definitely is. So just completely ignore that number and go completely just on how it sounds. Anyway, now that we've got that acoustic guitar riff and our vocals sorted out, let's take a look at another spot I use Trackspacer in this mix. Hey, I just want to take a quick second to tell you about the sponsor of this video, my mixing course. If you're sick of mixing courses where the raw tracks sound 10 times better than your final mixes, I feel ya. I'd get so frustrated when I'd buy a course only to hear them say something like, yeah, the guitars were recorded perfectly, so I didn't have to do anything to them. Or the drums already sounded great, so I just barely touched them. As someone who wasn't working with perfectly recorded tracks at the time, this felt like a giant waste of time and money. So when I decided to make a course, I wanted to do the exact opposite. I took one of the very first recordings I ever did in my first home studio and remixed that to show you that you can make killer mixes, even when the raw tracks are far from ideal. You can head on over to bettermixes.com/fixitinthemix to learn more. Anyway, let's get back to the video. So for this next example, I have our rhythm acoustic guitar and our drum soloed up. I noticed while listening to the whole mix that the snare drum was having a little bit of a tough time cutting through. And I think this guitar is part of what it's fighting with. So I added an instance of Trackspacer onto our acoustic, and I'm sending our snare drum to the sidechain. So much like with our last example, I think I want to leave the low end alone. So I'm probably going to have this up, I don't know, maybe somewhere around 1K again, so that I'm just ducking the top end. So let me play that and I'll dial that in a little bit. So yeah, I think somewhere around 1K will be fine. But it doesn't seem to be working as well as our last example. Even with the amount knob cranked pretty far, so we're getting quite a bit of ducking happening, it still doesn't feel like it really cleared up room for that snare, and I can hear the acoustic guitar pumping as the top end fades back in. So to deal with that, if we go over here and click on this blue circle, this will take us to our advanced panel. And the main thing we want to take a look at for this example is the attack and the release. Since we're dealing with a snare drum which is so transient heavy, with the default attack time of 5 milliseconds, by the time Trackspacer kicks in, the snare has pretty much already gone away. So in this case, let's bring both the attack and the release all the way down to their fastest values. We might end up backing the release off just a little bit, but for now let's start with it there and see what we've got. So now that's working a lot better. The top end of our acoustic guitar is just sucking out for a tiny fraction of a second, just long enough to make room for that snare drum. I still have the amount knob cranked a little bit higher than I probably would in the actual mix. I just want to make sure that you guys could hear what it was doing there. In most cases, I like to go fairly subtle with this plugin. I mean, there are definitely cases where you'll want to just crank it and hear it pumping, but in most of the cases, I want it to be pretty transparent. So a lot of the time what I'll do is I'll start with the amount knob all the way down on 0, and I'll slowly bring it up. And there's two things I'm listening for. One, in this example, I want to listen to the snare drum, and as I bring this up, I'll start to notice that it's a little bit easier to hear the snare drum. So then once I hear that extra clarity kick in, then I want to focus my listening back to the acoustic guitar and just make sure I'm not hearing any obvious pumping. And finally, let's take a look at one more spot that I use Trackspacer in this mix. So I have this instance loaded up on my electric rhythm guitars, and once again we have the snare being sent to the sidechain. So this was to solve the same problem as the last example. I just also wanted to create a little room in the electric guitars for the snare. So once again, we're using our low cut and high cut knob to focus where we want the reduction to happen. In this case, I've got our low cut quite a bit lower, so we're ducking out a little bit of the fundamental of the snare. And I brought the high cut down to about 5K, so we're leaving the top end of the guitars intact as well. But this is where the big difference from our last example comes in. Our rhythm guitars are panned out left and right, and our snare drum is obviously right up the middle. So I really only need to make extra room in the middle. So if we go back to our advanced panel, we can select between left, right, or mid-side mode. So here I've selected mid-side mode, and then this pan knob goes from letting you affect the entire signal, or just the side, or just the mids, or anywhere in between. So in this case, I have it set all the way to mid, so we're just touching the mids, not affecting the sides. So let me play this, and I'm going to crank the amount way, way, way up so you can hear exactly what's going on. So obviously that sounds pretty trippy. But hopefully you can hear we're just ducking out the mid signal. So whenever that snare hits and the ducking comes in, you can feel the guitars get super wide as whatever shared information between the left and right channel gets pulled out. But let's add our drums back in and dial this back into a more appropriate level. That sounded pretty cool. Just making a little extra room for the snare. And obviously there's a million more ways you could use this. Another spot I'll oftentimes use it is on the bass. I'll send the kick drum to the sidechain, and then I will use the high cut knob to just cut out the very, very, very low end out of my bass anytime the kick hits. And again, for that, I'll use the real fast attack and release, since we're dealing with a transient heavy kick drum. But it's also great for songs that have both synths and guitars in it. Sometimes they'll be fighting each other, or even making a little bit of space in your rhythm guitar tracks for a lead guitar, or a ton of other stuff. If you saw my video a little while back about the sidechain feature in Soothe 2, a lot of this video probably sounded kind of familiar, as Trackspacer is pretty much doing the same thing. But I think Trackspacer has a couple advantages. Mainly that it's really fast, easy, and intuitive to use. I mean, the main interface is literally 3 knobs. It's easy to just open it up and go without much fiddling around. I do wish they would fix the decibel readouts on the graph though. Like, obviously you should just use your ears to decide where it sounds right, and not make any decisions based on the gain reduction readout. But like, they labeled it, so the labels might as well be correct, right? But anyway, if you want to check out Trackspacer for yourself, I'll link to it in the description down below. Also, if you like this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe. It really helps the channel.